Power has always flowed along the banks of a river. This video will reveal how ancient rulers did not just use water, they weaponized it, turning canals and reservoirs into the very foundations of political control. You will discover the hidden blueprint that explains the rise and fall of empires across the globe. How did a simple ditch become a throne? Why would a king care more about silt than soldiers? We will journey from the sun-baked plains of Mesopotamia to the rainforests of the Maya, uncovering the startling truth that the greatest monuments to power were not always temples or tombs, but the waterways that fed them. What does it mean to hold the keys to life itself? This connection between water and power is not a modern observation. It is a theory that reshaped how we understand civilization itself. In the mid-20th century, a German-American scholar named Carl Wittfogel put a name to the pattern we have been describing. He called it the hydraulic hypothesis. At its heart, the idea is brilliantly simple. In dry, challenging landscapes, survival depends on controlling water. Small communities can manage their own small canals. But to build and maintain a vast network, one that can feed a city of thousands, you need something new. You need a commander. You need planners, overseers, and a legion of workers all moving in unison. According to Wittfogel, this necessity gave birth to the first true states. The managers of the water system became the managers of everything else. They controlled the food, and therefore they controlled the people. This centralized top-down power structure, born from the ditch and the dam, was what Wittfogel famously termed hydraulic despotism. It was a compelling story, one that seemed to explain the rigid hierarchies of ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, and imperial China with a single, elegant cause. But like any grand theory, it soon faced waves of criticism. Scholars began to ask, did the state create the large-scale irrigation, or did the irrigation create the state? The debate revealed a deeper truth. The relationship was not a simple one-way street. Water management and political power grew together, each shaping the other in a complex dance. So while Wittfogel's hypothesis may have been too rigid, it pointed us squarely at the engine room of early empire. It forced us to look past the palaces and see the canals as the true arteries of authority. The true genius of these waterworks lay in their versatility. A canal was never just a ditch for crops. It was a multi-purpose tool of statecraft, a liquid lever that moved far more than water. Think of the great rivers of Mesopotamia or the intricate channels of ancient China. These were the original highways. Barges laden with grain from distant provinces could float directly to the royal granaries, feeding the capital and its armies without the slow, costly overland journey. More importantly, those same barges could carry regiments of soldiers. A ruler could project military force down these aquatic corridors with shocking speed, putting down rebellions in one region while reinforcing frontiers in another. The waterway was a supply line and a troop transport, all controlled from a single, central point. But the political utility of water did not stop at logistics. Engineers quickly realized that a strategically dug canal could also serve as a formidable moat, a watery barrier protecting a city's walls. More subtly, canals and altered river courses could act as clear, unambiguous boundaries. They marked the limits of a kingdom's territory in a way everyone could understand. You lived on this side of the canal under this king's law and protection. They lived on the other side. It was a permanent, natural-looking border that was entirely man-made. Perhaps the most profound power, however, was symbolic. For an ancient ruler, mastering water was the ultimate demonstration of authority over the chaotic forces of nature itself. A pharaoh who could divert the Nile's flood, or a Chinese emperor who could command a river to change its course, was performing a kind of divine magic. They were not merely administrators, They were the guarantors of cosmic order, the protectors who held back chaos and ensured life would continue. The canal became a monument more dynamic than any stone statue. It was a living testament to a leader's wisdom, strength, and benevolence, flowing right past the homes of every citizen. To control water was to control the narrative of power itself. But to see this blueprint in action, we must travel to its birthplace. The land between the rivers, Mesopotamia, presents a paradox. It was a cradle of abundance built on a foundation of sheer uncertainty. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers did not offer a gentle, reliable flow. They were volatile giants, prone to devastating floods in one season and shrinking to a trickle in the next, all under a relentless sun. In this landscape, water was not a given. It was a prize to be seized and meticulously guarded. Survival here demanded more than hope. It demanded intervention. The Sumerians, in their city-states of Ur and Uruk, looked at this chaotic water supply and made a monumental decision. They would not just live with the rivers. They would redesign them. They began digging, channeling the life-giving waters away from the main channels and into vast, branching networks of canals that stretched like artificial veins across the dry plains. This was the world's first great engineering project, turning a floodplain into a garden. But a garden of this scale cannot tend itself. Who decides which fields get water first during a drought? Who organizes the thousands of hands needed to dredge the canals each year, clearing them of the relentless silt that threatened to choke them? The answer gave birth to something entirely new. The need for constant, coordinated management created the earliest templates of bureaucracy. Scribes emerged not just to record poetry or laws, but to log water allocations. Overseers were appointed to direct labor gangs. Rules were codified about maintenance responsibilities for different districts. The administration of water became the administration of society. The man who controlled the canal gates controlled the fate of every farm, every family, and ultimately the city itself. In Mesopotamia, the ledger and the shovel became the twin symbols of power, both born from the necessity of commanding a river. The evidence for this system is not hidden in ruins but preserved in clay. Across Mesopotamia, archaeologists have unearthed mountains of small, palm-sized tablets, each one etched with the precise, wedge-shaped marks of cuneiform writing. These are not epic poems or royal decrees. They are the paperwork of power, the mundane records that kept an empire hydrated. One tablet might list the names of 48 men from a village, assigned to dredge a specific section of canal for 10 days. Another meticulously notes that a farmer named Ernungel received his water allocation for his barley field on the 15th day of the month. Yet another is a report from an inspector, warning that the canal gate near the city of Lhasa is clogged with silt and requires immediate attention. This was bureaucracy in its most ancient and tangible form. The sheer volume of these administrative tablets is staggering. They document a society obsessed with measurement, scheduling, and accountability, all revolving around the control of water. This reliance on record-keeping created a powerful new class, the scribes. These individuals, trained for years in the complex art of cuneiform, held the keys to the system. They knew who owed labor, who received water, and where the resources were flowing. Their authority did not come from physical strength or noble birth, but from information. They were the original data managers, and in a state built on hydraulic control that made them indispensable. In many ways, these scribes and overseers became the world's first civil servants, the administrative engine that allowed a king's will to be translated into flowing water and full granaries. Their clay tablets were the protocols that turned a collection of cities into a coordinated, functioning state. This administrative machinery, however, was more than just a practical necessity. It required a story, a reason for people to accept this new, centralized authority. the rulers of Mesopotamia provided one of the most potent narratives in human history. They did not present themselves as mere managers. They declared themselves the chosen representatives of the gods, the divine shepherds tasked with bringing order to a chaotic world. And what was the ultimate proof of this divine favor? Water flowing where it was commanded. A king's most sacred duty, often recorded in his own inscriptions, was to dig the canals and keep them in good order. This was not public works, it was a cosmic ritual. When a ruler commissioned a new waterway, he would frequently give it a name that echoed his own glory, like the Canal of Sargon or the River of the King. These were permanent advertisements of his power, etched into the landscape itself. Artistic reliefs from the period show the monarch, not with a sword, but with a basket of earth upon his head, personally inaugurating a new canal project. This image was propaganda of the highest order. It framed the back-breaking labor of thousands not as forced toil, but as a participation in a sacred act led by a pious king. The logic was inescapable. When the canals were full and the harvests were abundant, it was visible proof of the ruler's righteousness and his unique connection to the divine. Conversely, a failed flood or a silt-choked waterway could be interpreted as a sign of divine displeasure with his reign. A king's legitimacy, therefore, was quite literally measured by the height of the water in the irrigation ditches. Prosperity was not an accident of nature. It was a direct gift from the shepherd king to his people, a continuous demonstration that he held the keys to life and order. Control of water became the physical script for a story of divine right, one that flowed through every field and into the heart of the state itself. Yet this narrative of divine kings and central control was not the only script written in water. Far to the east, in the fertile basin of the Indus River, a civilization crafted a masterpiece of hydraulic engineering that whispers a very different story. The cities of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, built over 4,000 years ago, reveal a society obsessed with water management, but one that seems to have done so without the loud proclamations of a pharaoh or a Mesopotamian king. Their achievement is staggering. Walk through the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro and you find a city built with a precision that feels almost modern. Beneath the orderly streets ran a network of covered brick drains designed to carry waste away from homes and public spaces. Nearly every house had its own private bathing area and a dedicated well, ensuring a clean water supply. At the city's heart stood the Great Bath, a large, watertight public pool lined with bitumen, likely used for important communal rituals. This was not a haphazard system. It was standardized, meticulously planned, and maintained for centuries across a vast region from the coast to the foothills of the Himalayas. The engineering is undeniable, but the engineers themselves remain a profound mystery. Where are the towering statues of glorified rulers? Where are the grand palaces that dwarf all other buildings? The evidence for such centralized, individual glorification is strangely absent. This presents us with a captivating enigma. How did a civilization coordinate such complex, widespread waterworks without leaving behind the usual monuments to a supreme leader? The answer may lie in the water systems themselves. Unlike the massive, state-directed irrigation canals of Mesopotamia that fed royal granaries, the Indus systems seem more focused on urban sanitation, personal hygiene, and perhaps equitable distribution. This suggests a different source of authority. Power may have been held not by a single divine monarch, but by a council of elders, a guild of merchants, or a class of priest planners who valued collective well-being over individual aggrandizement. The uniformity of their cities, from the brick sizes to the layout of the streets and drains, hints at a shared set of principles enforced not by a king's decree, but by a powerful, commonly held ideology. Their control of water was about purity, order, and public health, a form of power that flowed through community cooperation rather than from the top of a pyramid. In the Indus Valley, the greatest monument to authority may not have been a statue, but a perfectly functioning drain. The silent, collective order of the Indus Valley stands in stark contrast to another river civilization, where water and ruler were openly fused into a single divine identity. In Egypt, the very rhythm of life was written by the Nile. Its behavior was not a chaotic mystery to be tamed, but a predictable annual promise. Each summer, the river would swell with rains from distant highlands, spreading a layer of rich, dark silt across its valley in a life-giving event called the inundation. This was not a problem to solve with massive canals, but a gift to be carefully managed. The Egyptian model was one of capture and release, a system known as basin irrigation. Farmers built low earthen walls to create vast, shallow bowls along the river's edge. When the floodwaters rose, gates were opened, allowing the silty water to fill these basins. Then the gates were closed, trapping the water and allowing it to soak the soil for weeks before slowly draining away, leaving behind perfectly fertilized and saturated earth ready for planting. It was an elegant, patient form of farming, perfectly adapted to the Nile's generous cycle, but do not mistake this simplicity for a lack of organization. The scale demanded coordination. The timing of opening and closing those basin gates affected entire regions. Someone had to decide when to flood which basin to ensure fairness and maximize the land's yield. Someone had to organize the labor to maintain those miles of earthen walls after each flood. This logistical challenge created a natural center of gravity for power. That center was the pharaoh. He was not merely an administrator of water, he was portrayed as its divine source. In royal art and texts, the pharaoh is shown making offerings to the Nile god Hapi. He was the guarantor of the inundation itself, the essential intermediary whose piety ensured the river would rise as expected. The entire agricultural calendar, and thus the kingdom's wealth, was framed as a direct result of his sacred relationship with the gods. When the flood arrived on time and at the perfect height, it was a visible annual renewal of his mandate to rule. The fields that sprang green from the black silt were not just crops, they were proof of the pharaoh's cosmic efficacy. In this system, political power did not just control the water, it became synonymous with the life-giving cycle itself. The ruler's legitimacy was reaffirmed not by conquering armies alone, but by the simple, profound act of the river rising and falling as it should. Yet this divine connection to the Nile's natural cycle was not the limit of pharaonic ambition. A king's power could be measured by how far he could make the river's influence reach. During the Middle Kingdom, a period of reunification and renewed strength, the pharaohs embarked on a project that would redefine the very purpose of a waterway. It was no longer just about capturing the annual flood for local fields. It was about projecting Egyptian might far beyond its traditional banks. The focus of this ambition was a dry, eastern region known as the Wadi Tumilat, a natural corridor linking the Nile Delta to the Bitter Lakes and onward to the Red Sea. Here, pharaohs like the formidable Senusret III commanded the excavation of what would become known as the Canal of the Pharaohs. This was not a modest irrigation ditch. It was a strategic artery, a man-made river designed for conquest. By piercing through the Wadi Tumilat, Senusret created a direct aquatic highway for his military barges. No longer would Egyptian armies be forced on long, arduous desert marches to reach the mineral-rich lands of the Sinai or the trading hubs of Canaan. Now troops, siege equipment, and supplies could be floated swiftly and efficiently eastward, allowing for rapid, sustained campaigns. The canal turned a logistical nightmare into a manageable operation, extending the pharaoh's reach with every stroke of the oar. But its genius was multifaceted. This waterway also secured the lucrative trade routes that brought cedar wood from Byblos, copper from Sinai, and exotic goods from the Red Sea region directly into the Egyptian heartland. Controlling this flow of wealth was as important as any military victory. Furthermore, the canal acted as a permanent tether to newly conquered territories. It allowed for the continuous movement of administrators, settlers, and cultural influences, effectively integrating these distant lands into the Egyptian sphere. The water that flowed through the Canal of the Pharaohs carried more than just Nile silt. It carried the blueprint of the state itself, replicating Egyptian order in foreign soil. For Senusret and his successors, this project was the ultimate expression of power. It demonstrated that a true king could not only ensure the river's bounty at home, but could also redirect its life-giving force to serve his will abroad, carving his authority into the geography of empires. But the true test of hydraulic power is not in a land of plenty, but in a land of scarcity. In the vast, sun-scorched expanses of the Persian plateau, where surface rivers were rare and evaporation was relentless, survival demanded a different kind of genius. Here, the Persians engineered a revolution not on the water but beneath it. They mastered the art of coaxing life from the very bones of the earth through a system known as the Qanat. Imagine a gently sloping tunnel carved by hand through rock and soil, stretching silently underground for miles. It begins at the foot of a mountain, where workers dig a mother well deep into the water table. From there, the tunnel angles downward with a slope so slight, barely noticeable, that the groundwater it captures flows entirely by gravity. Every 100 feet or so, a vertical shaft is dug down to the tunnel, providing air for the diggers, a way to remove debris and later access for maintenance. From the surface, these shafts look like a line of craters marching across the desert, a mysterious dotted line pointing toward a distant, unseen destination. And at the end of this hidden journey, the water finally emerges into the open air, a cool, clear spring in the middle of absolute dryness. This was not a flashy monument. It was a secret, a subterranean river stolen from the mountains and delivered to the plains. The Achaemenid Empire, builders of the great palace at Persepolis, did not just use this technology. They institutionalized it. As their empire expanded, Persian engineers became geological scouts, identifying where the water table met the right slope. They would organize the massive, skilled labor force needed to dig these astonishingly long tunnels, some stretching over 30 miles. Where a Qanat was built, life followed. A new agricultural settlement called Barays would spring up at its mouth. Date palms would rise, fields of barley would turn green, and a community would take root in a place that had been barren for millennia. This is where the political power of the Qanat becomes clear. The empire did not simply provide water, it provided the possibility of settled, taxable life. By controlling the knowledge and the labor to build these systems, the Persian state held the key to colonizing its own arid territories. A local governor's authority was tied directly to the flow of the Qanats in his region. He was responsible for their upkeep, for settling disputes over water shares, and for collecting the imperial taxes from the prosperous communities they created. The system bound the frontier to the center in a profound way. A rebellion in a distant province was not just a political problem, it was a hydraulic one. Disrupt the maintenance of the Qanat, and the entire settlement it fed would wither and die. So loyalty to the imperial system meant survival. The Qanat, therefore, was more than a water source. It was a tool of quiet domination, a network of underground threads that stitched a vast, dry empire together into a cohesive, productive whole. The true capital of Persia was not just at Persepolis, but in every cool, dark tunnel where gravity did the empire's work. The Qanat was a miracle of local survival, but the Persian vision was imperial in scale. To truly bind their vast territories from the Nile to the Indus, the Achaemenid rulers knew they needed more than isolated underground springs. They needed a unified hydraulic network, one that mirrored the ambition of their royal roads and their sprawling administration. This is where the genius of kings like Darius I came into full view. He looked at the map of his empire and saw not just provinces but watersheds. His engineers undertook a monumental project to connect the separate veins of the land into a single, circulating system. They constructed massive surface canals like the one linking the Nile to the Red Sea, which revitalized trade. But more importantly for the heartland, they integrated these grand canals with the countless local qanat systems. Imagine a vast branching tree. The qanats were the deep roots drawing hidden moisture from the earth. The new imperial canals were the mighty trunk and primary branches, moving that collected water across regions to where it was most needed for state projects. This integration was a logistical masterpiece. It meant that the agricultural surplus from a fertile core province like Persia could be amplified and stabilized. Reliable water delivered through both tunnel and canal turned these regions into the empire's breadbasket, producing the grain that fed the armies, the court, and the laborers building Persepolis. This bounty did not stay put. The surplus was loaded onto carts and traveled the famous Royal Road, a highway whose rest stops and way stations were often strategically placed near these vital water sources. The road moved messengers and troops, but it also moved grain, and its efficiency was utterly dependent on the hydraulic network that sustained the communities along its entire length. Water management thus became a visible, undeniable pillar of imperial administration. A regional satrap or governor was judged not only on his tax revenues but on the maintenance of his waterways. Imperial inspectors traveled the roads and canals, ensuring that sluice gates functioned and tunnels were clear. The system demonstrated that the great king's power flowed as reliably as water itself, reaching from the mountain aquifer to the merchant's cart. It was a quiet, constant assertion of control, proving that the empire could not only conquer territory, but could make it flourish through a web of engineering and order. Yet this Persian vision of an integrated hydraulic empire would find its most enduring and sophisticated echo far to the east. In China, the relationship between water and power was not merely administrative, it was written into the very origin story of the state itself. The legend of Yu the Great is a foundational myth that begins with catastrophe. For generations, it is said, uncontrollable floods ravaged the land, drowning fields and scattering communities. The emperor at the time, Yao, appointed a man named Gun to solve the crisis. Gun tried to wall the waters in with dams and dikes, but his efforts failed. The floods only grew worse. After his passing, his son, Yu, was given the monumental task. Yu chose a different path. He did not confront the waters but guided them. For 13 years, he traveled the length of the land, surveying the rivers and mountains. He dredged clogged channels, deepened riverbeds, and carved out new outlets to the sea, creating a harmonious network that allowed the floodwaters to drain away safely. The stories say he worked so tirelessly that his hands and feet became calloused, and he passed by his own home 3 times without entering, so dedicated was he to his mission. His success was total. The floods receded, the land became fertile, and the grateful people proclaimed him their leader. Yu the Great thus earned the mandate of heaven, establishing the legendary Xia dynasty and becoming the archetype of the virtuous ruler. This myth is far more than a simple tale. It is a cultural blueprint that forever fused flood control and hydraulic engineering with legitimate rulership in the Chinese political tradition. Yu was not a conqueror with a sword, he was a sage with a surveyor's tool. His power came not from divine birth, but from benevolent service and profound technical understanding. The lesson for every subsequent emperor was clear. The first duty of a sovereign was to manage water. To control the floods and ensure irrigation was to demonstrate the virtue and competence that justified holding the mandate of heaven. A dynasty that failed to maintain the waterways risked not just famine, but the loss of that divine mandate itself. From its very mythological beginnings, the Chinese state was conceived as a hydraulic enterprise. The legend of Yu the Great found its ultimate physical expression centuries later, not in a myth, but in stone and water along the turbulent Min River. In the 3rd century before the Common Era, the region of Sichuan was a place caught in a brutal cycle. The Min River, swollen with mountain snowmelt, would rage down from the highlands each year, flooding the plains with destructive force, only to then recede and leave the land parched and cracked. It was a landscape of feast and famine, where communities lived in constant fear of the very water they needed to survive. The Qin state, ambitious and expansionist, saw this chaotic region not as a lost cause but as a potential powerhouse. Their solution was not a declaration of war but a declaration of profound understanding. They would not fight the river, they would converse with it. The project they embarked on, known as Dujiangyan, would become one of history's most elegant dialogues between human ingenuity and natural force. Unlike the massive dams of other civilizations, which sought to dominate a waterway, Dujiangyan's design was based on diversion and guidance. At a strategic bend in the Min River, engineers led by the governor Lai Bing constructed a long, wedge-shaped levee called the Fish Mouth. This structure, built from woven bamboo cages filled with stones, did not block the flow. Instead, it split the river in two. One channel, the outer river, was left to carry the main force of the floodwaters and silt away safely. The other, the inner river, was carefully channeled through a narrow opening cut into a mountain ridge, a passage named the Precious Bottleneck. This bottleneck controlled the flow, slowing the water and directing it into a sprawling, man-made web of irrigation canals that fanned out across the Chengdu Plain. The system included a spillway to drain off excess water during floods and a series of adjustable weirs for maintenance. It was a dynamic, living mechanism. Each component worked in harmony with the river's own energy, using its power to scour silt from the channels and regulate its own flow. The result was nothing short of a geographical miracle. The flood-prone wasteland of Sichuan was transformed. The once violent waters now traveled in a controlled, life-giving network, watering fields with precise reliability. The Chengdu Plain became the land of abundance, a fertile breadbasket producing massive surpluses of rice and grain. This agricultural wealth did not just feed local families. It fueled the ambitions of the Qin state. The bounty from Sichuan provided the steady, dependable supplies needed for prolonged military campaigns. With its rear secured and its granaries overflowing, the Qin could turn its attention outward, fielding larger armies for longer periods. The economic engine created by Dujiangyan became the logistical foundation for the Qin's brutal, methodical conquest of the rival warring states. The water that once brought destruction now flowed as the lifeblood of an emerging empire, demonstrating that the most powerful weapon for unification was not always the sword, but the shovel, the surveyor's line, and a deep respect for the river's own rhythm. The Qin's vision of unification, forged in the waters of Dujiangyan, would find its ultimate expression on a scale that defied the very geography of China. While local systems nourished regional power, a new dynasty sought to connect the empire's heart and soul. The Sui emperors, in a breathtaking act of will, commanded the digging of a waterway that would stitch the north and south together. This was the Grand Canal, a serpent of human labor stretching over 1,000 miles, linking the silt-heavy Yellow River in the arid north to the vast, fertile basin of the Yangtze in the lush south. To stand on its banks during the Tang dynasty was to witness the empire's pulse. Fleets of grain barges, hundreds strong, moved in endless convoys, their holds packed with rice from the southern paddies. This was the tax system made liquid. The south, with its 2 and sometimes 3 annual rice harvests, became the empire's granary. The north, home to the political capitals of Chang'an and Luoyang and the vast frontier armies facing nomadic threats, was the consumer. The Grand Canal solved a fundamental problem of imperial rule. How do you feed 1 million people in a northern capital when the local land cannot produce enough? You build a river that flows north, carrying the wealth of the south. This constant flow of grain was the ultimate stabilizer. It prevented famine in the capitals, which could spark rebellion. It fed the professional soldiers guarding the Great Wall, ensuring their loyalty. The canal turned distance into a manageable delay, transforming the perilous overland journey of months into a steady, predictable aquatic supply line that took weeks. Control of this artery meant control of the empire's stomach, and by extension, its stability. But the canal's purpose was not purely economic. It was a highway for imperial authority. Troops from the northern garrisons could be loaded onto government barges and dispatched south at unprecedented speed to quell unrest or reinforce governors. Imperial inspectors, tax officials, and messengers traveled the same route, their speed and efficiency binding distant provinces directly to the emperor's court. The waterway forced a profound integration. Different dialects, customs, and local economies were now part of a single, circulating system. A merchant from Hangzhou could sail his goods all the way to the gates of Chang'an, creating a unified national market. The Grand Canal did not just move grain and soldiers, it moved ideas, culture, and a shared sense of being part of a colossal whole. It was the empire's central nervous system, and the emperor held the reins. To sever it was to paralyze the state, which is why its maintenance was always a top imperial priority. This man-made river proved that true power was not just about controlling territory on a map, but about controlling the flow of life itself between those territories. Yet this grand vision of canals binding an empire was not the only way water could command a throne. Across the world, in the dense rainforests of Mesoamerica, a civilization faced a paradox of water. The Maya of the classic period did not live in a desert. Their world was one of vibrant green, of towering ceiba trees and seasonal downpours that could turn paths into rivers. Water, it seemed, was everywhere, but its abundance was an illusion, a rhythm of extremes. For months each year, the rains would vanish. The dry season brought a profound thirst to the land. The porous limestone bedrock of the Yucatan Peninsula, like a great stone sponge, swallowed surface streams whole. There were no great rivers to tap for irrigation. In this landscape of seasonal scarcity, water was not a constant to be managed, but a fleeting treasure to be captured and hoarded. Survival through the dry months depended not on diverting a river, but on trapping the sky. This fundamental challenge reshaped the very geography of Maya power. Great city-states like Tikal, rising from the jungle canopy, were not built near rivers. They were built around geology that could hold water. The Maya became masters of hydraulic architecture, turning their city centers into immense, engineered watersheds. They paved vast plazas with plaster, not just for ceremony, but to act as giant rainwater collection basins. They meticulously channeled runoff from these paved surfaces, and from the steep slopes of their towering temple pyramids into monumental underground chambers and lined reservoirs. At Tikal, the reservoir system was a complex multi-tank network holding millions of gallons, a lifeline calculated to sustain tens of thousands of people through months without rain. This was not a convenience, it was the city's beating heart, and the one who controlled the heart held ultimate power. The ruler, the Kayuhul Ajor or Holy Lord, positioned his palace and the central temples directly adjacent to the largest reservoirs. His divine authority was physically linked to the community's survival. When the rains ceased and the jungle grew quiet, the ruler alone controlled the distribution of this most precious resource. This gave him a form of power that was both practical and deeply spiritual. He was not just a political leader, he was the guarantor of continuity, the one who stood between order and collapse. Inscriptions and art suggest that dedicating and maintaining these reservoirs were among a king's most sacred duties, acts that demonstrated his communion with the rain gods themselves. The reservoir was a throne room made of water, and its gates were the levers of command. During a severe drought, the ruler who could open those gates for an ally or close them to a rival wielded an influence more immediate than any army. Control of water storage may well have dictated the dizzying patterns of Maya diplomacy and conflict, turning seasonal drought into a permanent tool of political strategy. But the Maya were not alone in mastering a landscape of extremes. On the opposite side of the Americas, along the narrow strip of desert squeezed between the Pacific Ocean and the towering wall of the Andes, another civilization faced a different kind of thirst. This was the coast of ancient Peru, a land where rain might not fall for years, where the only water came from a handful of rivers that tumbled down from the icy peaks, carving fragile ribbons of green through a world of sand and stone. Here, survival was an act of sheer defiance. The Moch people, who thrived from around 100 to 800 of the Common Era, looked at those fleeting rivers and saw not just water, but a blueprint for empire. They became hydraulic architects on a breathtaking scale. They did not dig simple ditches. They engineered vast, gravity-fed canal systems that snaked for dozens of miles across the parched landscape, capturing the precious Andean runoff and directing it into meticulously planned fields in the valleys below. These canals were feats of precision, cut through hard soil and rock, often with gradients calculated to the inch to maintain a steady, life-giving flow. Where a canal needed to cross a deep gully, the Moch built aqueducts. One of the most impressive, the Escope Aqueduct, stretches for nearly a mile and stands over 50 feet tall in places, a monument of mud, brick, and stone that defied the desert. This network turned barren valleys into lush, productive gardens, growing maize, beans, and squash. But the true power of this system was not just in its construction, but in its concentration. The most critical infrastructure, the main feeder canals and diversion points, were always clustered around the urban and ceremonial centers, places like the Huaca del Sol, a massive adobe pyramid that served as the political and religious heart of Moch society. This was a deliberate design. By centralizing the control valves of the water supply within the ceremonial core, the Moch elite created a powerful dependency. Every farmer downstream knew that his field's life depended on the decisions made at the center. The rulers, often depicted in magnificent pottery as warrior priests, positioned themselves as the indispensable intermediaries between the distant, life-giving mountains and the people. Their authority was literally channeled through the canals. When the water flowed, it was a testament to their divine connection and managerial prowess. This hydraulic grip only tightened with their successors, the Chimu Empire. Their capital, Chan Chan, was the ultimate expression of this principle. It was a vast, sprawling metropolis of adobe, the largest city in the pre-Columbian Americas. But Chan Chan was not built on a riverbank. It was built in the desert, a deliberate power play. The Chimu engineers executed their most audacious project, tapping the Chicama River and channeling its water through a long, complex canal to quench the thirst of their desert capital and its surrounding fields. The entire city was organized around this dependency. Its core was a series of 10 immense walled palace compounds, each one belonging to a successive ruler. Within these citadels were not just royal residences, but also massive, sunken reservoirs. These were not public wells. They were private, secured water banks filled by the imperial canal and controlled exclusively by the ruling elite. The message was unmistakable. The ultimate source of life was held within the king's own compound. The population lived in the outer neighborhoods, utterly reliant on the ruler's administration to allocate water from the central system for their own smaller canals and household needs. In this stark desert landscape, the Chimu state did not just manage water, it weaponized scarcity. Control was not maintained primarily by soldiers at the gates, but by engineers at the sluice gates. The ability to grant or withhold water was the ability to command obedience, to reward loyalty, and to crush dissent without ever drawing a blade. The political architecture of Chan Chan, with its walled reservoirs and centralized canals, was a physical diagram of power, proving that in a land without rain, the throne was always built atop the wellspring. This mastery of water in the desert finds a stunning parallel in the tropical monsoon of Southeast Asia. At the heart of the Khmer Empire, the city of Angkor rose not from stone alone, but from a calculated conversation with the sky. Here, water was not scarce but overwhelming. For half the year, the heavens would open, dumping torrential rains that turned the land into a vast, shallow sea. Then, for the other half, the rains ceased and the sun baked the earth. To build a permanent, grand capital in such a landscape of extremes required a hydraulic mind of extraordinary scale. Khmer engineers looked at this cycle of flood and drought and designed a solution that was both simple and monumental. They transformed the entire plain into a giant, managed catchment system. At its core were the immense Barays, artificial reservoirs so vast they resembled inland seas. The largest, the West Baray, stretches 5 miles long and over a mile wide, capable of holding billions of gallons of water. But these reservoirs were not isolated pools. They were the central hubs of an elaborate, city-wide network of canals, moats, and embankments. During the relentless monsoon, this network acted like the veins of a colossal organism. Canals channeled the destructive floodwaters away from the urban core and into the waiting Barays, safely capturing the deluge. Then, as the dry season gripped the land, the system reversed. A carefully engineered network of smaller channels and gates allowed this stored water to be released slowly and steadily across the surrounding landscape. This was the genius of Angkor. It turned an unpredictable, violent cycle into a reliable, year-round source of life. The captured monsoon water fed an elaborate system of rice paddies, enabling farmers to produce 2, sometimes 3 harvests annually in a region where nature typically allowed only 1. This agricultural surplus was the true foundation of Khmer power. It supported a population that scholars now believe numbered close to 1 million people, making Angkor one of the largest pre-industrial cities on Earth. That immense population provided the labor force for projects that seem almost superhuman. The temple complex of Angkor Wat, with its towering spires and intricate bas-reliefs, is the most famous. But it is just one of many. This entire architectural wonderland, from the mysterious faces of the Bayon to the jungle-cloaked Tarprom, was made possible by the full bellies of a population fed by engineered water. The reservoirs and canals did more than irrigate rice. They created a sacred geography. The Barays were often aligned with precise cardinal points, mirroring the cosmic ocean of Hindu mythology. The moats surrounding temples like Angkor Wat were not just defensive features, they were symbolic representations of the mythical mountains and oceans that defined the universe. By controlling this hydraulic landscape, the Khmer god-kings demonstrated a power that was both practical and divine. They did not just rule the people, they commanded the very rhythm of the seasons, taming the monsoon to fuel a civilization whose grandeur still takes our breath away. The stone temples were their legacy, but the water that fed the builders was their true throne. The sheer scale of the Barays forces us to ask a deeper question. Why would a society devote generations of labor to dig reservoirs of such staggering, almost unnecessary size? The answer lies in the water itself and what it represented. To stand at the edge of the West Baray was to gaze upon a perfectly flat, man-made horizon, a geometric mirror of the sky. This was not a haphazard pond. Its sides were precisely oriented to the cardinal directions, and its dimensions followed a sacred, mathematical order. In the Hindu cosmology that shaped the Khmer world, the universe was centered on Mount Meru, the home of the gods, surrounded by a series of concentric mountain ranges and oceans. The great temple of Angkor Wat was designed as a microcosm of this universe, with its central towers representing the peaks of Meru. The vast moat surrounding it symbolized the cosmic ocean. The Barays extended this sacred geography across the entire city. They were the earthly manifestations of those primordial waters, the divine ocean brought down to the human plane. By ordering the landscape into this perfect symbolic geometry, the Khmer king was performing the ultimate act of rulership. He was not just building infrastructure, he was replicating the structure of the cosmos. He was quite literally bringing heaven to earth, imposing a divine order upon the chaotic, monsoon-drenched wilderness. Every citizen who saw these immense, placid sheets of water understood their deeper meaning. They were a daily, visible reminder that their king was a Divaraja, a god-king, whose authority was as vast and fundamental as the mythical oceans themselves. This symbolic power, however, was built on a foundation of very real human effort. The political statement of a Baray was made not with words but with the movement of earth. Historians estimate that constructing the West Baray alone required moving millions of cubic meters of soil, a task that would have demanded the coordinated labor of tens of thousands of people for years. This was the engine of corvée labor, a system where subjects owed a period of service to the state. Mobilizing such a workforce, feeding them, housing them, and directing their efforts with a single purpose was the most profound demonstration of a king's temporal power. It proved his ability to command the very bodies of his people, to redirect the energy of an entire society toward a monumental collective goal. The Baray was therefore a paradox. It was a gift of life giving water to the population, a benevolent act of a caring ruler. Yet simultaneously, it was a monument to their own compelled labor, a permanent testament to their subservience. The king's dual role was perfectly encapsulated in this water. He was the generous provider, the divine architect of abundance. But he was also the uncompromising commander who could summon you from your village to move mountains of dirt for his vision. The reservoir's water nurtured the rice that fed your family, but the reservoir's walls were built by your own hands under his decree. This intertwining of benefit and obligation created a powerful, self-reinforcing cycle. The successful harvests from the irrigated fields produced the surplus that fed the court, the army, and the next wave of laborers for the king's next great project, whether it was another temple or another Baray. The system fed itself, and at the center of it all was the ruler, positioned as the indispensable source of both spiritual order and material survival. The water in the Baray was the liquid expression of a social contract written in mud and stone. The immense reservoirs of Angkor were a testament to control, but in the Maya world, that same control faced its ultimate test. A civilization built on capturing the sky could only endure as long as the sky provided. For the classic Maya, their mastery of water storage contained a hidden vulnerability. Their entire political and social structure was predicated on the Holy Lord's ability to guarantee water through the dry season. The reservoirs were both a lifeline and a ticking clock. When the rains returned reliably each year, refilling those vast tanks, the system was a brilliant success. It proved the king's divine connection and justified his supreme authority. But what happened when the rains did not come? Not for one season, but for several. Modern climate science, using data from lakebed sediments and stalagmite formations in caves, paints a stark picture of the 9th and 10th centuries. The evidence points to a series of severe, multi-year droughts that gripped the region. These were not ordinary dry seasons. These were profound shifts that pushed the engineered landscape beyond its limits. The meticulously plastered catchment basins gathered little runoff. The monumental reservoirs began to shrink, then stagnate. The lifeline grew thin. In this crisis, the very foundation of Maya political power began to crack. The ruler's sacred promise was to mediate with the gods and ensure the water's return. When the ceremonies failed and the reservoirs remained low, that promise rang hollow. The elite's exclusive control over the water supply, once a source of their strength, became a point of intense social friction. If the king could not deliver water, on what grounds did his authority rest? The failure of the hydraulic system likely triggered a cascade of political and social failures. Scarcity breeds conflict. Competition over the dwindling water reserves would have intensified, not just between city-states, but within them. Loyalty to a ruler who could no longer perform his most basic, life-giving function would have eroded. The intricate networks of trade and tribute that bound the cities together, networks sustained by agricultural surplus, would have frayed. Communities may have fractured, with people abandoning the great ceremonial centers to seek water and sustenance elsewhere, perhaps returning to smaller, more dispersed settlements that were less dependent on the massive, failing infrastructure. The collapse of the classic Maya civilization was not a single event, but a slow unraveling. While factors like warfare and resource depletion played their parts, the shattering of the hydraulic contract between ruler and ruled appears to be a central thread. The political fragmentation of the Maya world can be seen, in part, as the direct consequence of a water management system that succeeded brilliantly under stable conditions, but contained within it the seeds of its own vulnerability. When the environment shifted beyond its design parameters, the entire edifice of power, built so carefully around those reservoirs, began to crumble from the inside out. This vulnerability points to a deeper truth about all hydraulic power. A canal or reservoir is not a monument you build once and forget. It is a living, breathing system that demands constant care. The relentless silt that settles in a Mesopotamian canal, the mud walls of an Egyptian basin that crumble after each flood, the jungle roots that threaten to crack a Maya plaster catchment, these are not occasional problems. They are the daily reality of a water-based state. This creates an immense, unending demand for organized labor. Every year, when the floodwaters receded or the dry season ended, the call would go out. Thousands of farmers would be summoned from their fields, their own work set aside, to spend weeks or months wading in mud, hauling baskets of earth and repairing stonework. This was the corvée labor system, the lifeblood of hydraulic maintenance, and it was a double-edged sword. When managed fairly, when communities could see their own survival in the cleared waterway, it could foster a sense of shared purpose. But when the demands grew too heavy, or the labor was seen to benefit only the elite in their distant palaces, that shared purpose curdled into resentment. The very act that sustained the state could also become its greatest source of friction. In China, where the mandate of heaven depended on water management, the historical records are filled with the echoes of this tension. Dynasties rose and fell not just because of invasions, but because of silt. When a central government grew weak or corrupt, the first thing to be neglected was often the maintenance of dikes and canals. Local officials might pocket the funds meant for repairs. The labor conscription could become brutal and endless, tearing farmers from their families during critical planting seasons. This neglect had a direct, terrifying consequence. The carefully managed rivers would break their banks. Floods would sweep away entire regions, bringing famine in their wake. And in the wake of that famine, the people would rise. Many of the great peasant rebellions that toppled Chinese dynasties, from the Yellow Turbans to the Red Turban Revolt, found their tinder in these moments of hydraulic failure. The rebels were not just starving farmers. They were often the very laborers who had been forced to maintain the system that then failed them. Their anger was directed at a ruling class that had broken the sacred contract embodied by Yu the Great, the promise that in exchange for their labor, the state would guarantee order and water. A neglected canal was more than an engineering problem. It was a visible symbol of a broken promise, a crack in the foundation of political legitimacy. The power that flowed from controlling water was, therefore, always balanced on a knife's edge. It required the ruler to be both a benevolent provider and a relentless taskmaster, a duality that could sustain an empire for centuries or unravel it in a single season of drought and discontent. Yet the story is not so simple as a single, all-powerful cause. The hydraulic hypothesis, for all its compelling logic, cannot be the final word. If we look closely, we find cracks in the theory, places where the blueprint does not quite match the ruins. Take the Indus Valley civilization we discussed earlier. Here was a society that mastered water on an immense scale, with its standardized drains, wells, and great bath. Yet archaeologists have searched in vain for the palaces, the grand royal tombs, or the monumental statues of a single, all-powerful hydraulic despot. The power structure seems diffuse, perhaps shared among councils or guilds. Their water management appears focused on urban sanitation and civic well-being, not on concentrating agricultural surplus under one ruler's control. This suggests a path to complexity that did not require a central tyrant commanding the sluice gates. Furthermore, if aridity and large-scale irrigation were the only prerequisites for state formation, how do we explain the rise of powerful, centralized societies in regions with abundant rainfall? The classic Maya, as we have seen, faced seasonal drought, but their core environment was a rainforest. Their challenge was storage and distribution, not creating water from nothing. In other parts of the world, like the fertile valleys of Mesoamerica outside the Maya realm or in parts of West Africa, states emerged where rainfall agriculture was perfectly viable. In these places, the impetus for centralization may have come more from warfare, from controlling trade routes for luxury goods like obsidian or gold, or from the unifying power of a shared, compelling religion. The hydraulic model, in its purest form, struggles to account for these variations. It risks reducing the dazzling diversity of human political creativity to a single, mechanical equation: control water, command people. The reality was far more dynamic. Water management was rarely a lone actor. It was part of an ensemble, interacting constantly with other forces. A king's authority might be rooted in his control of irrigation, but it was reinforced by his role as the chief priest, the supreme judge, and the commander of the army. The grain surplus from the canals fed the soldiers who protected the trade routes. The wealth from that trade financed the temple rituals that legitimized the king's divine right to control the water in the first place. It was a reinforcing loop, a web of mutual support. Warfare could drive the need for more centralized resource management, including water. A shared religious ideology could motivate communities to contribute labor to massive hydraulic projects for the glory of the gods, not just a fear of the ruler. Trade networks could introduce the wealth and ideas that made such grand projects conceivable. Rather than a simple cause, water management is better seen as a critical amplifier. It took the seeds of social complexity, whether planted by conflict, faith, or commerce, and allowed them to grow into something monumental and enduring. It provided the steady, predictable surplus that could support non-farming elites, the priests, the artisans, the scribes, and the soldiers who are the hallmarks of a state. But it did not plant those seeds alone. The true picture is one of intricate feedback, where the control of water becomes both a tool for and a result of growing political power, woven inseparably into a larger tapestry of human ambition and belief. Rome's aqueducts were marvels of public utility, but their purpose reveals a different model of power. These soaring stone channels brought fresh mountain water directly into the heart of the city, supplying public baths, ornate fountains, and the private homes of the elite. For the average Roman citizen, the aqueduct was a tangible benefit of imperial rule, a symbol of a civilization that could conquer nature itself for the comfort of its people. It enhanced urban life, supported public health, and displayed the engineering might of the state. Yet this water was not primarily about controlling the food supply. Rome's grain came from overseas provinces like Egypt and North Africa, secured by naval power and tribute, not from local fields irrigated by state-managed canals. The aqueduct was a magnificent amenity, a tool for fostering civic pride and social stability, but it was not the primary lever of political authority. The emperor's power did not fundamentally depend on his role as a water distributor in the same way it did for a pharaoh or a Mesopotamian king. The system showcased imperial benevolence and technical skill, but it was one thread in a much larger tapestry of military, economic, and legal control. Half a world away, in the ancient Sri Lankan kingdom of Anuradhapura, water told a completely different story. Here, the landscape dictated a return to the hydraulic core of kingship. The climate featured a sharp divide between monsoon rains and a long, punishing dry season. To sustain a kingdom, rulers had to capture the deluge and hoard it. Their solution was the construction of massive, cascading reservoirs known as tanks. These were not the decorative, reflecting pools of a Roman villa. They were colossal, earthwork dams that created artificial lakes, some covering thousands of acres. The largest of these, like the Abhaya Wiwa built by King Panjukabhaya, were the very foundation of the state. Their function was singular and vital, to store monsoon water for the intensive cultivation of rice, the staple crop and the source of all wealth. The king's sacred duty, repeated in countless inscriptions, was to build and maintain these tanks. His legitimacy was measured by the area of rice paddies his reservoirs could water. This created a direct, unbreakable link between the monarch and every farmer's harvest. The king was not just a remote ruler, he was the provider of life itself. The tank system wove political authority directly into the agricultural cycle. Control of the sluice gates meant control of the kingdom's food, its surplus, and therefore its stability. This was power flowing through mud and water, a model far closer to the ancient Mesopotamian or Khmer blueprint than to Rome's urban showcase. In Anuradhapura, the throne was quite literally built upon the dam. But a canal or a dam is more than a functional tool, it is also a permanent billboard. Ancient rulers understood that the most powerful propaganda is not written on fragile parchment, but carved into the landscape itself. They made sure their greatest hydraulic achievements came with a signature. At the head of a new canal, beside a massive reservoir, or on the face of a newly tamed river cliff, they would erect a stone monument. These stelae or carved reliefs were the ultimate press release, designed to endure for centuries. Their message was always the same: I, the king, did this for you. The water you drink, the fields you farm, the life you live, flow from my wisdom and my strength. In Assyria, the annals of kings like Senusret are not just lists of battles. They boast with meticulous pride about hydraulic conquests. Senusret recounts how he built a vast system of canals to bring water to his capital, Nineveh, describing the precise dimensions and the lush gardens it created. He doesn't just say he brought water, he says he caused abundance to flow. The inscription transforms an engineering project into a narrative of royal generosity and divine favor. The people using the canal would see its source marked by the king's own words, a constant reminder of where their prosperity originated. In Egypt, this practice was sacred duty. Pharaohs like Amenemhat III left inscriptions at the massive waterworks they built in the Fayum region, explicitly tying their reign to the region's newfound fertility. The message was carved in stone so that both the gods and future generations would bear witness. It declared that the king was the good shepherd who made the Nile serve every field, framing the state's administrative control as an act of paternal care. These monuments served a dual purpose. For the local population, they were a daily lesson in loyalty. Every time a farmer drew water from a channel marked with the royal name, he was participating in a ritual of dependence. For rival powers and for posterity, they were a territorial marker and a resume of achievement. A visiting diplomat or a rebellious chieftain would see not just a water source, but a declaration of the king's ability to reshape the world. The infrastructure itself became a living, flowing monument. A visitor to an ancient kingdom would not need to ask who was in charge. The answer was written in the water coursing through the king's canal and etched in the stone beside it, a permanent fusion of utility and ideology that turned every drop into a testament of power. The true scale of these ancient waterworks often lies hidden, buried under centuries of silt or swallowed by jungle. So how do we know they ever existed? The story of their discovery is a modern detective story, one where technology becomes our time machine. The first clue often comes from the sky. Archaeologists now use satellite imagery to scan vast landscapes, looking for subtle scars on the earth invisible from the ground. A faint, straight line cutting across a desert, a slightly different color of vegetation tracing a perfect geometric shape. These can be the ghostly outlines of a long filled-in canal or the footprint of a vanished reservoir. But to see through the forest canopy, researchers employ an even more powerful tool. LIDAR, which stands for light detection and ranging, works by firing millions of laser pulses from an aircraft. These pulses penetrate the leaves and bounce off the solid ground below, creating an incredibly detailed, three-dimensional map of the Earth's surface stripped bare of vegetation. In the jungles of Cambodia and Guatemala, LIDAR has revealed entire cities and their accompanying water networks hidden for 1,000 years. It shows the precise grids of canals at Angkor, the hidden reservoirs at Maya cities like Tikal, and the raised causeways that acted as dams. This bird's eye view reveals the astonishing truth. These were not isolated projects, but carefully planned, city-wide hydraulic grids, landscapes completely redesigned by human intention. Yet a map only shows us the shape, not the story. To understand how these systems were used and when they failed, scientists turned to a quieter form of evidence: mud. The technique is called sediment core analysis. Imagine taking a long, hollow tube and pushing it straight down into the bottom of an ancient reservoir or a filled-in canal. When you pull it up, you have a vertical timeline, a cylinder of mud and silt that has been accumulating layer by layer, year by year for centuries. By analyzing this core, researchers can read a detailed environmental history. Layers rich in pollen from cultivated crops like maize or rice tell of periods of intensive farming supported by the waterworks. Sudden layers of coarse sand might indicate a catastrophic flood that breached a dam. A shift to drier, dustier sediments could signal the onset of a prolonged drought, a time when the reservoir sat empty. By carbon dating organic material trapped in these layers, scientists can pin these events to specific decades, correlating the rise and fall of water management with the known political history of the civilization. It is like reading the diary of the landscape itself, page by muddy page. For structures that lie completely underground like the Persian Qanat, a different kind of radar is needed. Ground-penetrating radar sends pulses of energy into the earth and listens for the echoes that bounce back from buried features. Dragging this device across the desert surface, researchers can detect the hollow signature of a collapsed tunnel or the distinct circular pattern of a filled-in vertical shaft, mapping the entire hidden course of a Qanat without ever digging a single hole. Each of these technological threads, the view from space, the record in the mud, the echo from below, weaves together into a richer understanding. They allow us to move beyond the grand temples and statues and see the foundational engineering that made those monuments possible. We are no longer just studying kings and battles, but the very pulse of the civilization, measured in the steady flow of water through a man-made channel. This detective work reveals a sobering truth. The most enduring marks of these ancient empires are not always their grandest stoneworks, but the subtle, intelligent ways they sculpted the water that gave them life. Every buried canal they uncover forces us to reconsider what we mean by power, showing us a world where authority was measured not in gold, but in the reliable delivery of a simple, clear drink. The principles etched in those ancient canals and reservoirs did not vanish with the empires that built them. They simply evolved, scaled up with concrete and steel, and found new expression in the 20th and 21st centuries. The modern era witnessed the ultimate realization of the hydraulic state's ambition, not in a network of hand-dug ditches, but in singular, monumental structures that could stop a river in its tracks. Projects like Egypt's Aswan High Dam or China's Three Gorges Dam stand as the direct descendants of those ancient systems, operating on the same enduring political logic. These are not merely power stations or flood control barriers. They are instruments of profound national transformation, designed to bend a river's entire purpose to the will of the state. By generating vast amounts of electricity, they fuel industrialization and bring modern energy to millions. By regulating water flow, they protect downstream cities and create massive, reliable irrigation schemes that turn arid regions into new agricultural zones. The economic and strategic benefits are undeniable and often celebrated as triumphs of human ingenuity over nature. Yet, in achieving these goals, they also replicate the ancient patterns of centralized control and social reordering. To create the immense reservoir behind a modern dam, landscapes are fundamentally altered. Communities that have lived along a river for generations are relocated, their homes and histories submerged beneath the rising waters. The state makes the calculation that the collective good of the nation outweighs the displacement of thousands or even millions of individuals. The authority to make that decision, to redirect a river's life and reshape human settlement on such a scale, is a form of power that any pharaoh or Mesopotamian king would instantly recognize. It is the power to command geography itself. Furthermore, control over the water released from the dam, how much and when, grants the central government immense leverage over entire regions downstream. Water allocations for farms, cities, and industries become matters of high policy, negotiated not between local villages, but in distant government offices. This creates dependencies that bind provinces to the capital, much as ancient canals bound farmers to the temple granary. The modern dam, therefore, is more than an engineering feat. It is a political statement in reinforced concrete, a declaration that the state holds the ultimate authority over the most essential resource. It demonstrates that the ancient blueprint using water infrastructure to consolidate control, reshape economies, and project national identity remains a powerful force in our world today. The technology has changed, but the fundamental relationship between water, engineering, and political power flows on as steadily as the river itself. This journey across deserts, rivers, and rainforests reveals a single, unifying blueprint. From the very first moment a community dug a ditch to guide a river, they were not just farming. They were engaging in politics. The fundamental insight is this: in the ancient world, to control water was to control the very definition of life itself. It was the master key that unlocked three essential pillars of power: survival, wealth, and movement. The ruler who commanded the canals commanded the harvest, and with it, the ability to feed a city, an army, and a burgeoning class of administrators. This agricultural surplus was the original capital, the wealth that built everything else, and by engineering the waterways, that same ruler could direct this wealth and his own military force across the landscape with unprecedented speed. The waterway was a highway, a border, and a supply line rolled into one. But perhaps the most profound realization is that these canals and reservoirs were never passive scenery in the story of early states. They were active, dynamic characters. They were the instruments that made the state possible in the first place. The need to manage large-scale waterworks created the world's first bureaucracies: the scribes with their clay tablets, the overseers with their labor rosters. This administrative hierarchy, born from the necessity of dredging a canal, became the skeleton of government. The water project also provided the perfect stage for legitimizing rule. By framing the control of floods and the delivery of irrigation as a sacred, cosmic duty, kings and pharaohs transformed technical skill into divine right. A full reservoir was proof of a king's virtue. A well-timed inundation was a sign of heaven's favor. Furthermore, these systems created deep, inescapable economic dependencies. A farmer living downstream from a state-controlled sluice gate, or a settler in the desert whose entire existence relied on a Qanat maintained by imperial engineers, was bound to the central authority in the most practical way imaginable. Their loyalty was tied directly to the flow of water. This synthesis shows us that the political map of the ancient world was not drawn only in treaties and battles. It was etched first and foremost into the watershed. The grand temples and palaces we so often admire were merely the spectacular byproducts of a more foundational power, one that flowed quietly through every channel and basin, shaping the destiny of civilizations long before a single stone was laid. So the blueprint becomes clear. Across every continent, in deserts and rainforests alike, the mastery of water was the foundational technology of political power. It was the original operating system for the state. These ancient canals and reservoirs reveal a universal principle, one that echoes far beyond their time. When a leader controls a society's most vital resource, they hold the keys to survival, to wealth, and to movement. That control builds the administrative machinery, justifies the ideology, and creates the deep dependencies that bind a people to a central authority. It is a path to power as old as civilization itself, yet these achievements hold a profound duality. They stand as breathtaking monuments to human ingenuity, to our relentless drive to understand and reshape our world. But within their elegant channels and vast basins, they also encoded the very structures of control, the hierarchies, the labor demands, the centralized authority that defined life for millions. As you look at the rivers, dams, and aqueducts in our own modern world, consider this ancient legacy. The politics of water, the delicate balance between collective benefit and centralized power, was not invented yesterday. It was written thousands of years ago in the slow, purposeful flow of water through a hand-dug ditch, a lesson in stone and silt that continues to shape our world today.